Okay, we're going to go ahead and do our video 3 for our spring break notes here. Self kind of settled, where we should be. Alright, here we go. Video 3. So we're picking up with the invasion of Panama. This is our post-Cold War foreign policy. In December 1989, the U.S. intervened in a country not related to containment or the Cold War, which is one of our first. It's going to be one of the first countries we have to deal with in the post-Cold War era, and have to kind of figure out what our role is now in this post-Cold War era as well. Bush removed dictator General Manuel Noriega to stop him from using Panama as a drug pipeline into the United States. We also stayed to oversee the elections of a new government in Panama as well too. Then you had the Persian Gulf War in 1990, when Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded oil-rich Kuwait and threatened Western oil sources in the Persian Gulf. You can see a picture here, Iraq, where Saddam Hussein invades into Kuwait right here, which was at one point part of Iraq, but also oil-rich, because it would obviously help benefit Saddam Hussein's government. Bush, the U.S., and the United Nations put international pressure on Hussein to stop, but that didn't work. Bush was also hesitant to get involved in another massive war like this. He didn't want another Vietnam, and so he made sure that the United Nations and the Congress were okay with this, and so he gets approval to go in and take care of business. And so in January of 91, we launched Operation Desert Storm, where we put 500,000 American soldiers into the Persian Gulf, into Kuwait, along with soldiers from 28 other nations. After about 5 weeks of bombing and 100 hours of ground fighting, Iraqi forces were defeated. Now, Bush did not remove Saddam Hussein. He felt like he lacked the mandate to go in Iraq and remove his forces, and so all we did was kick him out of Kuwait, which some people regretted later on when we had to go back and fight another war here in the 2000s. But Saddam Hussein does get to live to fight another day and stay in Iraq as a result. Bush also got a 90% approval rating as a result too. So we're going to go now to his domestic policies, which are much more lackluster. Bush had a lot of successes with foreign policy, but not so much with domestic. So the first issue was the nomination of Clarence Thomas to the Supreme Court, this man right here. African-American Thomas was replacing Thurgood Marshall. Thomas's conservative views were protested by African-American organizations, and he was not well received by that community. But what was also more famous about this nomination process is his allegations against him of sexual harassment by one of his former workers named Anita Hill. Now, the whole situation, you had thousands of women believe in her accusations, but what hurt her accusations was the fact that every time that he got promoted, she basically followed him. And it wasn't kind of physical assault, it was just basically, word of mouth type stuff, but it made her look less credible. But it also just generally made people more aware of sexual harassment and so on. But in spite of those concerns and his tarnished reputation, Clarence Thomas still became a Supreme Court justice, which he still serves as today, and he was still confirmed. Taxes and the economy are big for Bush. Americans were shocked to learn that the U.S. government would pay out $250 billion under Bush to help these failing savings and loans banks that were deregulated back in the 80s, while we were also doing a lot of deficit spending in the 1990s. Also, our annual deficits pushed the national debt over $1 trillion, that's a trillion with a T, under Bush. Now, that's not really his fault. That's a lot of the results of the Reagan policies, but it carried over into Bush as well, and the debt just got higher and higher. So in 1990, Bush had a vote to raise taxes along with the Democratic Congress, breaking his 1988 promise to not read my lips, no new taxes promise, but it helped the economy. So the whole purpose was to help the economy, but it hurts his potential re-election in 1992. Also in 1990, a recession hit, ending the Reagan prosperity, and it rose unemployment, which it hurt Bush's potential for re-election as well. So you get what we call political inertia in the early 90s. Bush liked a big domestic program. He signed the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which basically served as a civil rights act for Americans with disabilities or handicaps. But he also cut out a lot of federal program funding, and it made a lot of Americans seem left behind the Reagan Revolution. A lot of things weren't getting done with the Democratic Congress and Republican president, so just a lot of nothing was going on, which led him not get reelected essentially in 1992, which leads us to Bill Clinton. So 1992, a stagnant economy, huge deficits, political deadlock, fuel disillusionment of government. Bush ran again, but seemed out of touch, and many were not impressed with his foreign policy successes and were mostly concerned with the economy and the stagnant economy at the time. Democrats picked Governor Clinton of Arkansas, who was the first baby boomer president we had, who seemed more articulate and energetic than Bush was. He also labeled himself a new Democrat, who focused more on economic issues like jobs, health care, education, and he made himself appear more as a moderate as well, too, trying to make himself not seem like a big tax and spend, New Deal, Great Society type politician. What also hurt Bush was that there was a third-party guy named Ross Perot who ran against him, a Texas billionaire who ran himself as an anti-Washington candidate, who didn't win any electoral votes but won 20% of the popular vote in his anti-D.C. campaign, the best showing of a third-party candidate since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. Democrats went along to win the White House and both houses of Congress as a result, so Clinton could get some things accomplished. So we're going to now look at some of the things he did in his first term and see how they panned out. The first of which is the failure of healthcare reform. Over 40 million Americans were without health care in the early 90s. Clinton put his wife in charge of the health care reform, Hillary Clinton. You can see a picture of her working towards this in the early 90s. It called for things like government-supervised health care insurance, guaranteeing it to every citizen. It faced a lot of opposition from Republicans, insurance industries, and small business organizations. Republicans were able to successfully make Democrats look bad, both in Congress and Clinton, by calling them tax and spend liberals and saying that Clinton broke his promise of being a moderate, and it basically ended any chance of reform. And so you're not going to see any major policy change here with insurance, or no government mandated insurance either. And we all know that the healthcare reform doesn't come until 2010 under Obama, 2 decades later, basically. But it is going to directly lead to Clinton getting hurt in the 94 midterm elections when Republicans take over Congress, which leads us to NAFTA. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. This won notable victory with free trade zones with U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Supporters said it would help all three economies and create more U.S. jobs. Opponents said more U.S. jobs would go to Mexico, and it would hurt the environment because of weaker pollution laws in Mexico, which are both partially right. There's a lot better economy from both or all three countries trading, but at the same time, a lot of jobs have been outsourced because people don't want to pay higher wages here in America, union wages and so forth, because it's more costly. So they do ship jobs out to places like Mexico, which is one of the things that Trump's been trying to address, at least in his campaign. We'll see if it actually pans out or not. And that brings us to the midterm elections in 94. Republicans gained control of both houses for the first time since 1954. They benefited from Democrats increasing taxes and federal regulations under Clinton in his first 2 years. As a result, Clinton then said the era of big business is over in 1995 in his State of the Union address. And the new Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, this man right here, proposed a new Republican plan called Contract with America, which proposed a much more conservative plan for the Republican Congress. They suggested scaling back the government, cutting taxes, and balancing the budget. So this leads to a showdown and an eventual shutdown between Clinton and the Republican Congress in 95, which at that point was a much bigger deal than it is now. Now we've had a couple of these recently, but that was much bigger back in the day. Clinton wanted a leaner, not meaner government, as he said. He and Republicans had a showdown that led to this government showdown in October 95 when the budget would be proposed. The two sides couldn't reach a deal until the spring of 96. The whole plan of Republicans was to make Clinton look bad for not making a budget and hopefully get him unelected in 96, but actually backfired into the exact opposite, where Clinton looked better here, and actually it helped him get reelected in 96 and made the Republicans look worse. Which leads us to the balanced budget and the budget surplus. So 96, Republicans had a compromise with Clinton. They left Social Security and Medicare intact. They limited welfare, more on that in a minute. They set immigration restrictions. They increased minimum wage and balanced the budget, which led to our first surplus since 1969 as of 1998. So for the first time in 98, we're going to have the government doing not deficit spending and actually doing savings and having a surplus for the first time in about 30-something years. So the balanced budget and the rising economy got him reelected in 96, which brings us to the welfare reform that he does in 96. So in 96, Clinton and Congress do sign the Welfare Reform Act, which basically helps probably more conservatives and Republicans than it does actually Democrats. This eliminated federal guarantees of cash assistance in favor of block grants to states and in order for them to run their own welfare programs. Basically meaning that you're going to give federal money to states, let them decide how to use their money as opposed to the federal government. It put lifetime limits on the amount of aid families could receive and required adults to find work within 2 years, and it put more conditions on food stamps as a result. So it made some of the first major restrictions on welfare since basically the New Deal, actual restrictions and expansions of welfare. And then finally you have a very not big deal election 96 with Clinton's re-election campaign. Republicans ran Senator Bob Dole, but Clinton won a landslide in terms of electoral votes. He was the first Democrat to get re-elected since FDR. But Republicans held Congress going into his last 4 years, meaning that now Republican Congress and a Democratic president are going to have to work together, which actually resulted in 4 good years of actual prosperity and compromise as a result. But we're going to end video 3 there.